Before I hand over to Devesh, I would also like to take this opportunity to talk briefly about the upcoming Lean India Summit that SolutionsIQ is hosting in Bangalore. The summit is the first in a series of lean events that SolutionsIQ intends to host in India. And the same is basically a community event which will focus on the latest developments and happenings in the lean world. For more details, I would request you to visit www.leanindiasummit.com. I would now hand over to Devesh to take over. Enjoy the webinar. Thank you. Over to you, Devesh.
Hi Antara, thanks. Hi guys, this is Devesh Chanchlani. I'm a technical agile coach with SolutionsIQ and I have around like 8 years of experience. I've worked on many agile projects and I have a lot of experience working on competitive projects with very competitive clients. So I share my experience with you guys, having worked on BDD and experienced BDD. So let us begin this webinar. So the topic of today's webinar is aligning engineering with business value through BDD. So in here we will be talking about various challenges that guys even feel, the developers even face when they are doing TDDs. So even while doing TDDs, there are various challenges that people face, and which is why quite experienced practitioners evolved the concept of BDD. So let's see how it actually helps the engineers as well as adds more business value when developers embrace BDD. So let's begin talking about common agile methodologies, the development methodologies that we use in agile development. So let's begin with test-driven development. So let's see what actually test-driven development says. The test-driven development, the foremost rule of the test-driven development is the code should be tested. So every time, so which actually means like every time there's a failure of test case, like any of the test case within a test suite fails, it clearly implies that something's wrong with the behavior. Something has gone wrong and the code is not behaving as expected. Another postulate is each unit of code should be covered by test, which actually means like no code should be actually going in, should be actually checked in until and unless there's a suite of tests around it. Each unit of code should be driven by test, which is actually test-driven development. So the thing is, we need to make sure like no unit of code makes in without a test case. And the best practice is to write a test case first and then derive your code from it, which is actually first you define your requirement and then you code around it. This is what makes test-driven development. Another is architecture should be arrived through continuous design following TDD. So this thing favors actually small upfront designs rather than big upfront designs. The big upfront designs, if you do big upfront designs, you actually lose the focus. And if you do small upfront designs as and when required, as in when you evolve the app, as in when you build on the app, you scale the app, you keep on doing that by putting up small upfront designs. So these small upfront designs help you achieve your small goals gradually and actually enable you to gain the bigger picture. So this is how the test-driven development is defined. So let's have a look at a general TDD workflow. How do we actually do test-driven development? So in test-driven development, we actually have a user story first. In a normal Scrum or Agile methodology, a team works by defining user stories at the beginning of each sprint. So when a developer gets down to coding, he actually picks a user story, reads it, understands it, and then he actually, based on the understanding of the user story, he actually picks up the first acceptance criteria or the first scenario, understands that, and then he actually writes the first piece of unit test code. And then the unit test code actually fails. Now the developer actually writes a piece of code and now the unit test case passes. Similarly, developer goes ahead and writes a bunch of unit test cases and and subsequent code blocks, and finally he codes an entire component. Similarly, he codes other components within the app. And after he's done with a number of components, a developer, a nice practitioner in an agile environment, he actually writes a series of integration tests around those components just to make sure they fit in together, they work together, they adapt to each other well, and they actually give out a behavior which is the intended behavior. The exactness of the app when a number of components act together. This is how test-driven development actually works. But there are certain challenges to this approach as well. What are the challenges? The challenges that experienced practitioners figured out were like when a developer picks up a user story, he reads a scenario, he has to thoroughly understand it, and then based on his thorough understanding, he has to first decide when what the initial test code should be, what the initial unit test should be. So the challenge is, the foremost challenge that a developer faces is where to start writing the scenario, where to start coding to satisfy the very first scenario in a user story. So the first thing is that the first challenge that the developer faces is where to start, what to test, what not to test, how much to test. So broadly speaking, the challenge that developer faces when he starts down to do a test-driven development for a certain user story is defining the scope of the first test case that he wants to write, and hence the scope of the first code that he would be actually writing and checking in. Subsequently, another thing that the developer might face is how to name your test cases and understanding why a test fails. So generally, when you have actually written a number of test cases and you have a rigorous test suite around your app, and if a certain test case fails, what does it actually convey? How can you actually get around it? But before that, you have to understand the cause of the failure, what functionality actually broke, which is the developer needs to understand the intent of each test case that he is actually adding to the test suite. This is another challenge that a developer faces. Another challenge that a developer might face is how would the current code bit fit in the bigger picture. The bigger picture could be a user story, and you are currently trying to code one particular scenario of a user story. An even bigger picture could be the system or component to which you are trying to add a new feature. An even bigger picture could be the entire application, which consists of a number of modules or such systems. So actually the code that you're trying to check in, the code that you're trying to add, where it actually would figure as compared to the bigger picture of things. So when you start doing a test-driven development, your such question is still unanswered, which means you begin coding by keeping in mind certain assumptions. That is, currently whatever you are trying to code, it is some assumption-driven development. It is good that we are doing test-driven development, but then again, this is the major challenge that one faces, because one has to assume, one has to imagine more into the things. And the major problems with assumption-driven development is you might code more than what the application requires, or you might even miss one of the important blocks that was actually required by the application. Moving ahead, let's see. So the questions that we currently face is defining the scope of the current unit of test code, the intent of the test that you are going to write, and then again there are a lot of assumptions creeping in. So, but we have only stepped out doing the wanting to write the first unit of code, first unit of test case. So if we try going a step backwards, we started with a user story. A user story is something which has a clearly defined scope, it has a clearly defined intent or motivation, and it is clearly client driven. It has been clearly come out of the client itself, from the product owner itself. The product owner itself has given you the client directive. So the thing is, this actually gives out the intended behavior of the system that the product owner had mentioned you, and this is exactly the gap that you are facing when you've stepped out of the user story and stepped into the arena of test-driven development. So this is the gap. So the experienced practitioners over the period of time when they were doing test-driven development, they really face this gap between the exactness of the user story and the exactness of the test-driven development of the test codes when they wanted to write it. So there was a gap between the exactness related to the behavior of the system. So they came up with the evolved concept of behavior-driven development, and they defined a certain workflow around it. Let's see the behavior-driven development workflow and how it actually evolves and how is it a bit different from the test-driven development. In a behavior-driven development, first the developer or the coder picks up a user story. He specifies a scenario for the user story. So a user story might be consisting of a number of scenarios. So he picks up the very first scenario. He runs the scenario and he watches it fail. So he actually codes the scenario in the kind of a test. He runs it and he sees it fail. Next, what he does is he specifies the behavior of the component of the system in the form of an example. That is, he tries to define the scenario, expedite on it with the help of an example. Now he runs the example and watches it fail. Now he implements the minimum functionality to make the example pass. It is this step wherein the developer actually adds a piece of code and he starts adding to the application features. Now he runs the scenario, and if it fails, he continues with the A. That is, if the scenario fails, he again does something. He again adds some code to make that scenario pass. And if finally that scenario passes, if the particular example passes, he then can move on to add another example. And similarly, if he feels that the scenario is satisfied, he can move on to the next step wherein he could add another scenario. Let's look at it with the help of an example. For example, we have a user story. As a bank manager, I want to offer reward points to the credit card customers so that they feel being valued and can use the reward points to order various gifts from the shopping portal. Pretty simple. The story is pretty simple. It's something like, I being the manager of a bank, I want to reward my customers for whatever the expenditure they are doing using my credit card. So let's define a foremost scenario for this user story. The foremost scenario for this user story is, given a credit card customer, when I spend a certain amount for my credit card from my credit card monthly, then I should get certain reward points. Now there's again a certain set of conditions that go in before a person gets his reward points. It depends upon the amount that the guy is spending and the reward points that he's getting. So then you expedite on this scenario with the help of certain set of examples. The examples could be something like, if the amount is 0, the points incurred are 0. If the amount is again 99, then the points again are 0. Then the third example says, if the amount is 100, then you incur 1 point. The thing is, you need to have at least 100 rupees spent before you incur a point, before you get a point. Similarly, you can have other sophisticated conditions also going in the form of example. And when all the conditions, that is all the examples turn green, Then you can move on to adding another scenario to this user story and subsequently code for it. This is how a behavior-driven development workflow works. So what you would actually do is you would first add a test case for the scenario, and then you might have the test case get values from the example, and you can actually check when the test case turns green, and when the test case turns green, you can move on and add another scenario, and so on. So what's the new approach like? How does the new approach work? So new approach actually works in the form of behavior test. So first what you do is you add an integration test or a behavior test right away. Like in our last example, we actually added the scenario. We add a test for the scenario before we even write down any piece of code or talk about any class or any functionality, any module that has to be changed. We first begin by adding an integration test or a behavior test. By adding the behavior test, we then identify the components that would come into act, that would actually act regarding the current feature or the user story. So now when you identify these components, then you get down by adding few unit test cases and build on that component. You add few more unit test cases, build on the other component, and finally your integration or the behavior test turns green. So this approach is pretty different, is a bit different than the traditional TDD approach. So let's see the contrasting behavior of a BDD and a TDD. So in BDD, we think in terms of behavioral terms. So the thing is, in a TDD, how you actually name your test cases. In a TDD, you might name your test cases as test if the for testing whether the bill was incurred or not, you would actually write something as test 0 bill. Another test case could be named something as test reward points rounding off, because if the reward points have to be rounded off, you cannot have the reward points given in decimal places. Similarly, you can have another test case saying test reward points calculation, in which like for every 100 rupees spent, you would have a reward point which is 1. But in a behavior-driven development world, you would actually write your behavioral test in a fashion which actually is similar to an entire sentence. So an entire sentence can actually give you the correct understanding of the scenario that you are trying to code. So in a BDD, your test cases would be named something as should reward no points when the bill is 0. This makes much clear sense, and this is quite implicit as compared to the test case when you were doing the TDD, that is a test 0 bill. It is less understandable, but when you write something as should reward no points when the bill is 0, it is like more implicit, more clearer. Then you might have another scenario or a behavior test named as should round off reward points to the floor value. For example, if you spend 999 rupees, so you might be having reward points worth 9.99, and they should be rounded off to the floor value. That is, you might end up getting 9 reward points. So something like that. So this makes more sense. Then you might have something like should reward 1 point on every rupees 100 spent. So in your BDD environment, you actually name your test cases in a way which actually are sentences, rather than writing small words which actually then you have to join dots and make sense out of it. So in BDD environment, it is pretty clear. What to call your test is easy. How much to test becomes more clearer, because you can only describe so much behavior in a single sentence. Then again, When a test fails, it also clearly infers the cause of the failing test case. So benefits of thinking in behavior could be: what to call your test is easy, how much to test becomes more clearer, reason of a test failure becomes clearly evident, because now you don't have to join your dots and figure out what exactly failed. But now talking in terms of an entire sentence makes it more elaborate, and you don't have to think much as to what is going on. Another, BDD is still a TDD, you see. You still arrive at coding by following the red-green factor. You do the test first programming, you first write a BDD test case, and then you actually code. You still follow the design principles and practices. You still favor the micro-incremental design. You do smaller front designs first, and then you actually arrive at bigger designs. And once your BDD test case is green, then you might again go ahead and refactor your stuff. Actually, BDD covers more ground than TDD, although TDD is at its core. So with BDD, you start thinking in a bigger perspective, whereas in TDD, you start thinking in a smaller frame of mind, and then you actually try to make it big. BDD is a second generation agile methodology in the sense as it has been derived from the extreme programming practices and the lean software development. It is still the same thing. It is not way different from a TDD. BDD is multi-scale. So by multi-scales we mean that the specifications can be described at multiple levels. You can have the top level focus on user interaction. You can have further down can focus on affected areas that fulfill the higher levels of expectations. Even lower, we can focus on technical implementations still with a solid focus on the behavior. So by using a BDD, you can actually focus on all the levels of development, be it the UI development or integration of various system modules or defining behavior of small classes and the interaction within the classes. Again, the BDD is pull-based and outside-in approach as compared to TDD. In TDD, we first do a unit test case, then we build on a component, then we build different components, and then we do the integration tests around them, which is actually an inside-out approach. And it is kind of a push-based approach because you are pushing the functionality into the system. Whereas in a BDD, you first do a behavioral test which actually represents your feature or a user story. Based on that behavior test, you just identify various components, and then you build on different components by writing another layer of or another level of a behavioral test, or which is quite similar to a unit test, and then you build on your respective components. So in this approach, we can clearly see this is a outside-in approach and this is a pull-based approach. By saying an outside-in approach, we mean that you begin by your user story and then slowly you build on the components that are required to be modified or enhanced to accomplish what you want to do in the user story. Rather than you first accomplish your components and then you try to figure out how they could adapt to the functionality that you want to achieve in a user story. So actually in your TDD, it is more of assumption driven, wherein you start coding for a component, assuming things about it, and then later when you're done with the components, you try to integrate them, you try to fit them together, and you make sure that the achieved functionality in a user story or the feature is complete. Whereas in a BDD, it is more of a client driven. You start coding itself by taking into consideration the requirements of your client. So in an assumption driven development, the things are, they actually need substantial upfront design in some kind of modeling tool. You have to, before you get down to coding something, you have to make certain assumptions. And to work on those assumptions, you have to come up with those upfront designs, and you have to use modeling tools like UML, and you have to make those designs so that they give you a feel-good factor. But eventually what it does is it actually causes waste by decreasing accuracy and increasing rework. And the developer may develop more than what the app needed, or might actually miss what was actually required. But as compared, the client-driven development is slightly different. It actually forces the developer to prove the value of the design by experiencing it first. It is focused on what you are actually developing. You implement exactly what is needed. Another thing is, by using client-driven development, you don't have to make the different components fit in together after they have been developed. You design them in a fashion that they are developed in a fashion which makes them automatically fit in together and work together in a manner which is seamless. So just to have a closing note, I would like to let you know what actually the experienced practitioners feel about the BDD. BDD creates more harmony between the user story and the test-driven development. It is so because you pick up a user story and then you begin developing on top of it using the basic postulates of TDD intact. You then move ahead, but the user stories practices represent analysis and specification in agile projects, and TDD represents software design. Using BDD, developers are able to consider interface from the perspective of the consumer of the service rather than the producer of the service. And finally, BDD aims to bridge the gap between the differing views of the computer systems held by business users and technologists. It is so because now all the people involved in the development, be it the business users or the technologists like developers, QAs, they are all thinking in terms of the user story that has been defined, keeping into mind common vocabulary, and now the development is going in tandem with the common vocabulary. That is in terms of behavior-driven development. That is in terms of behavioral testing. So, which is why it helps align the thinking of the business users and the technologists, which eventually helps the developers see the user story from the perspective of consumer of the service rather than simply producer of the service. Thank you guys, that was about it. Can we have certain questions?
So, Devesh, we have one question here.
Okay.
This is from Chandrasekhar. What are some of the tools used in BDD, and are these dependent on the technology of the underlying system?
Yeah, so various tools are actually used. For example, in the Java arena, mostly JBehave is used. Then we have Cucumber and Aspects as well. People are also using Jasmine in JavaScript. So yeah, so actually we begin by using tools which are actually relevant to the current technology that is being used in the project. So if you are coding on a Ruby project, you generally pick up Cucumber, or if you're on Java project, you should actually pick up JBehave because it lessens the efforts that you want to work upon.
Okay. A similar question that has come up is, can you recommend certain frameworks for incorporating BDD?
Yeah, so JBehave and Cucumber are the frameworks that have been tested over the period of time, and people have really felt the use of it, and they were actually the pioneers in BDD.
Okay. Next question is from Amita. Amita asks, how can I incorporate BDD halfway through the project where the team is new to Agile?
So currently you guys might be using, so I assume you guys are already doing kind of a test-driven development. wherein like you guys must be writing some unit test cases and might be even doing some automation test cases using Selenium as a tool, or might be other similar tools. So if that is the case, then you can easily start using a related framework, which could be a Cucumber or a JPA.
So
And
Amita is saying that they are not really using any such framework currently.
okay, if that is the case, so then the team, what I would suggest as a coach, as I've been with a number of teams so far, so the team should be first learn to appreciate the test-driven development practices, and once they really learn to appreciate the test-driven development, then they can really do the BDD quite. They can do BDD with flying colors. Having said that, they need to understand the basic postulates of TDD, and instead of picking up a unit testing framework, they can clearly pick up a behavioral driven development framework like a JBA or Cucumber.
Next question is from Himanshu. Himanshu asks, do we need to change any approach in writing stories for business analyst?
Yeah, so this is a nice question. So the thing is, so one of the basic criteria for having done a successful BDD project, the thing is the thinking of both the business side and the developer should be completely aligned. So that is, care should be taken that the user stories that are being defined, they are descriptive enough, they are elaborate enough with well-defined acceptance criteria. Based on these acceptance criteria, it becomes easier to define BDD scenarios. And if the BDD scenarios are easily defined, they are clearly defined, I think there can be nothing which can hold the team back which can hold back the team uh, from implementing good BDD practices. It's just that the user story should be well defined.
There is one more question from Kunal. He asked, do we need to make use of wikis for having an automated BDD environment?
I have seen a team in Chennai which actually has a set of wikis. So in that wiki, what they actually do is they have a set of user stories, and they have corresponding scenarios against those user stories, and then against those scenarios they have written a set of behavioral tests in their own suite. And so when they actually run their test case and something fails on the CI environment, on the continuous integration environment, it actually sends an email accordingly as to what functionality belonging to what user story field. So actually the thing is, having a wiki is good, but it can be, sometimes it can be an overhead. All you need to focus on is writing good behavioral tests and integrating them with the CI. So that's what is required. And the behavioral tests are written in a fashion, in a descriptive fashion, in the form of sentences. They themselves let you know what functionality actually has gone bad or is it not working. So I think like maintaining a wiki for the purpose could be an overhead.
Right. We have actually lots of questions. The next one is uh, is about, do you think we need to give external training for developers as we are new to TDD and BDD, or is it easy to learn? Do you think?
Actually, the developers are are very smart, so I don't think so. Like anything holds them back from learning newer stuffs, and it shouldn't be a challenge. But the thing is, if you have an external training or a coaching kind of stuff, then it actually fastens the process. It actually acts as a catalyst to your entire process, to your development, and you actually learn from the coaches, from the experiences, and they actually tell you how to uh, have a good enough environment for doing successful behavioral testing. So yeah, a coaching always helps because you learn from others' experience rather than having to learn them on your own. So yeah, that's the thing.
There's one last question that I would like to raise on behalf of Satish. Whose role is it to write BDT test cases? Product owner or developers?
Yeah, so that's a very nice question actually. So actually the product owner should be involved at defining the user stories and its proper acceptance criteria. What the team can do is they can come up with metaphors or common vocabulary using which the product owner can actually define the acceptance criteria. And based on that vocabulary, actually the developers can get down and write behavioral tests. And they can actually take that forward, breaking those behavioral tests into different levels until they get to a lower level where they are actually writing unit test cases. And it becomes easier for the testers as well, for the QA staff as well, to figure out what exact functionality is being tested or is being coded for. So yes, the development actually, the unit test cases are actually developed by the developers itself, but keeping in mind a common vocabulary between the business users, the QAs and the developers.
Fair. One last question,
Mhm.
Devesh. This
Mhm.
is from Sai Krishna.
Mhm.
Do we need? I think he missed on to one word. Do we need any global format for writing BDD so that everyone can understand? Is there a global format?
There's no global format for it, but the thing is, if you're talking about common practices, you can visit these websites related to the framework that you are trying to use. That could be a JBehavior website or a Cucumber website. They actually list down common practices of coding behavioral tests. Apart from that, as I just mentioned, you guys need to define a common vocabulary so that the entire team talks in terms of that vocabulary or metaphors, and it becomes easier for the guys to code the behavioral test, as well as it becomes easier for the non-technical guys to understand what behavior is being added. Yeah.
We reach to a closure of our webinar today.